recording. There we go. Hi everyone, and welcome to Hurtwood's first psychology podcast, where every month Josh and I will talk about current psychological debates, topics and ideas, often controversial, but always to do with teenagers. So today we have one on puberty, specifically breaking down the stereotype of a moody teenager, answering the question why kids say you don't understand me to parents, and rebelling with drugs and alcohol. And over to Josh to do our first.
Right, I'll get cracking. So I'm going to talk a little bit about like the idea why teenagers and adults don't quite understand each other at times. And to back that up, I'm just going to refer to a study that was conducted in 2007, which was Blakemore did an fMRI study on adolescents and adults. And the age range for the adolescents was 12 to 18, whereas adults was 22 to 38.
Yeah.
And they took these fMRI studies while the participants were being questioned. They were asked a couple of statements and they were asked to say whether they thought they were sarcastic or not. It was irrelevant if they were correct or not. All they wanted to do was ping the areas where we use our brains to go through social cognition and social interaction. Anyway, what they found out was that teenagers and adults actually use different parts of our brain to go through social processing and go navigate our way through social dilemmas. And what they found was teenagers often use anterior regions, adults often use posterior regions. And so when a teenager says something like, "Oh, you never understand me, you never understand the way I think," that might literally be because they don't use the same thought processes. They don't use the same area of the brain.
Yeah, actually, I agree with you, and that is really, shocking, because it's like we're completely different. We're seeing the world completely differently. In relation to that, there's a hormone called TPH, which in adults calms them down, in teenagers stresses them out. So what does that mean? Do we have completely two versions of life? Is it normal? Does this explain, why teenagers tend to disagree, have more arguments with their parents at this age? Because it's true.
But also true that based on that, they might be more emotional as a result.
Oh, definitely more emotional. And that's because of, unfortunately, when we're teenagers, we don't have a fatty tissue covering our neurons, myelin, and when we're in adults, we do. The problem without this fatty tissue is that everything is louder, in the sense that emotions are more intense. Happiness, much more intense. Sadness, much more intense. Anger, much more intense. Chaos is what it is. That's
talking about that, sort of that kind of goes into what we were talking about right at the start about the stereotypes of teenagers and what we have. So the stereotypes we put on teenagers, although they may be true, they may just be down to biological facts. Like when we have the idea of like the moody teenager, that probably is the case just because of our biology and the way our brains are working. Everything is heightened, like you said, because we don't have that fatty reserve residing on top of our brain tissue.
Yes, I agree that biologically lots of importance. Here's another problem that we get at teenage years: social aspects, peer pressure. We're learning who we are about ourselves. We fit in with the wrong crowd, or even if we're just emotional and we kind of want to be independent like we always want to be, we rebel. Yeah.
So talking about rebelling, that leads me on to my second piece of research, which is about basically in teenagers, what we have a developed accubomed nucleus. I can never pronounce that, but oh well. And basically what that means is that's the part of the brain that's responsible for our needs, our wants, our driving motivations. And that's the same in teenagers going through puberty and adults. It's already matured by that point. So that means we have the same desires. We want sex. We want to drink alcohol. We want to do all the things adults might want to do. The problem is our preorbital frontal cortex is not as mature, and that's the part of our brain that's analyzing risk, and it's not as mature. So what we end up having is we have we perceive like our desires as in very, very intense, and then the risks is not so much.
God,
So,
no, it is really dangerous, and I was also reading up upon that. Rather controversially, obviously this hasn't been proven, but it's a suggestion. So, the regions at the back of our brain, like the limbic region, so associated with emotions and memories, it matures much earlier than the prefrontal cortex. So it's been suggested rather, that maybe we need to take risks in order to develop the most efficient type of processing in a brain when we're older. Do we need to take risks, or
no, you don't need to take risks. There are students that don't ever involve themselves in behaviors like that, and they turn out fine. I'm very confident they turn out fine.
I agree, but without taking risks, and I'm not jumping straight to drugs and alcohol, I'm just saying taking risks helps us decide where we are morally, our ethics, where we fit in society, what's right, what's wrong. We need to make mistakes. That's
Okay, I thought you were going to go straight on to drugs. That's why I held back.
I mean, we can. Should we go? I'm going to go on to it now, just
All right,
to
we'll talk about drugs.
more just controversial. Okay, so there's also this study from in the US by an American psychologist called Spears, and in 2002 he took adolescent rats and adult rats. He gave them both the same amount of alcohol and found that the adult rats were much more sensitive to the alcohol than adolescents.
Oh, okay.
So
I see what you're driving at.
does it mean that maybe kids don't feel it as much? I don't know. I just
What? And so therefore they binge like quantifiably more amounts of alcohol or whatever they're putting in their body simply to feel the same way? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that maybe it's even healthy to take risks.
Okay, it's healthy to take risks, but what kinds of risks? Like if you start injecting like heroin into your body, that's not a worthwhile risk.
Look, obviously the studies on rats, we're different to rats.
Yeah.
But there's been a lot of studies, even in our academic syllabus.
Yeah.
Rats with drugs, and how rats with.
No, but that was talking about what you're talking about there is like, is it Skinner? I cannot remember. But who did the experiment on behavior and giving rats drugs. I think it's Skinner. I don't know for a fact.
I don't know either.
I can't remember. But that's to do with behavior. That's not to do with like the physical impact it has on the rats. Like the behavior might be the same. Like you could argue that, okay, since they don't feel it as strongly, maybe they abuse the substance more to feel the same way as compared to adults. But that doesn't, that's not to do with like, that's more a behavioral thing. That's less of a physical impact thing.
I mean, yes, but as we've unfortunately seen, every kind of, let's say, mental illness and things like that, which can be triggered by drugs, especially we know weed, marijuana is linked to schizophrenia. That takes obviously biological vulnerabilities in our genes and environmental triggers.
Yeah.
So the kid has the teenagers, not a kid, has vulnerable genes.
Yes.
They've got peer pressure.
Yes.
Want to rebel. Their parents don't understand.
The preorbital frontal cortex is an utter nightmare. Doesn't associate risk quite right.
They are gonna end up doing something bad. Can we limit the amount that's bad? Yes, absolutely. But I think it may be inevitable that they do something bad. It may be just once in their life. Let's say bad in terms of illegal. I think it's inevitable.
No, but you're still, even though you don't have as developed like conception, sorry, not conception. What am I on about? Acknowledgement of risk. Like it may not be the same. It's still there. Like we have talks at school. We know the impact that drugs can have on your life. That is a choice that is completely independent of anyone else. I don't like peer pressure. there's an argument to be made with that, but to say that it's inevitable for people to end up taking like serious drugs,
No,
I don't think
you're
is quite right.
You're jumping to that. I said it's inevitable that they may turn to something bad. It will be bad. It might just even be stealing a shop. Like not stealing a shop,
Stealing the whole shop.
stealing a chocolate bar from the shop. I'm just saying that it's inevitable that we take risks, whether that's the really dangerous ones. Obviously, that's not the ideal case.
Yeah.
But then, you have to think the laws in place, drinking age.
Mm-hmm.
What is the right thing? Because if we know kids are going to take risks, will they rebel if you make it higher? Or will they rebel less if you make it lower? Or will they rebel still the same?
I mean, there's a lot of biological evidence, like we've been talking about with the fatty reserves that sit on top of our brain tissue, that mean we don't, like, emotions are a lot higher. So if we then say, okay, if you take a certain drug, likely, like, your emotional experience would then be a lot higher as a teenager. Then you can kind of support the argument that maybe we want to put up the drinking age maybe to 21, but then does that drive more risky behaviors, because your Cuban nucleus still wants those same desires that we have as an adult? So does that increase the risk actually of teenagers just going off on their own and drinking? It's a sticky situation.
I'm going to be the devil's advocate and say, so Switzerland, they have this thing which is staggered drinking age limit. So at 16, you can have softer drinks like beers, cider, and then at 18, you can have spirits. Now, I know there's still going to be teenagers drinking illegally, but it kind of gives them a sense of, I'm older now, maybe.
Yeah, a bit of satisfaction. Yeah.
I don't know.
I do agree, because we're talking about like satisfying like the Cuban nucleus, like satisfying those desires that we want as an adult, like that little bit of freedom, but then kind of it's slowly implementing it as we get older, and obviously like as those increase in intensity. Like I think if you was to start giving teenagers like spiced 40% rum, that wouldn't be so great. But if we're talking like a 2-3% beer, there's not too much risk involved in that.
Yeah.
Unless you're drinking absurd amounts. But we talked a lot about drinking, but another thing I'd like to talk about is just the stereotype that we have of sort of teenagers always trying to reinvent themselves.
Yeah.
And that there may actually be quite a bit of evidence supporting that biologically. The medial prefrontal cortex, it's an area in the brain that's responsible for self-evaluation, self-reflection. It's at its peak at 15.
15, right.
15.
Okay.
So when we think about teenagers and the stereotypes we put on them, it's probably just because that part of the brain is blaring so much during your teenage years. And that's why people might become more body conscious. They might be more conscious about how they fit inside of social groups. And we're more susceptible, therefore, for peer pressure, because that side of us it's always constantly sounding off in our head that we need to fit in. We need to look a certain way. But that's just down to our biology.
Something is really like buzzing in my head now when you said peer pressure, body image, social media.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah. 15 is the age we are allowed to join social media.
Yeah.
That's the same time where we're having all these questions, developing all these insecurities. I mean, that cannot be a healthy mix of things.
No, because while your medial prefrontal, like your medial, MPFC is going on and on and on, you're open to all these influences about like certain ways people are supposed to look, who are like fingers thin, and it's like no, it's definitely not a good thing. Definitely not a good thing. But how do you fix it? Because these big companies, their biggest market, the biggest percentage that are going to be using these platforms the most are going to be teenagers.
Do we put on legal time limits, or do we?
It's an independent company. I don't think you can.
Yeah.
I don't think you can put. I don't know the law, but that well. But I'm very confident no one would support like putting legal limits on an independent company,
or potentially just, let's say, taking phones away at school. I know a lot of schools do that, but maybe that's just on keeping them busier. I don't know. Obviously, there's going to be a parent involved to help, because if they go home, if it's not a boarding school, they go home, the parents are going to be the one monitoring. So do they need to be educated on this?
I just think that's the thing that's going to come with time. Like the generation that's become before us, they didn't grow up with phones. I don't think that's quite come into place yet. I mean, when our generation like has the new generation, then that's a topic that can be talked about, but it's not something we can cover yet. But we've talked a lot about risk and rewards, and I'm curious as to your opinions on punishment for those criminally. How do we deal with like child offenders? Because last year, well, not last year, I mean, we're in the new year now, so 2 years ago, 2019, there were 18,000 children were sentenced with a criminal sentence. I mean, 65% of that is community work, but that's still a sentence. So that does imply that teenagers will take very risky behaviours.
Josh, you left the biggest question to the end, and I know this is going to be another podcast topic, but I'm just going to say a tiny little sentence and say, maybe we should punish them less and re-educate them more, because we're still at the learning age.
But you're kind of mitigating the impact of taking those risks. You're kind of heightening the rewards because the risks are far lower. And we know that teenagers won't process risk even the same way, because their preorbital frontal cortex is not working the same as it is in adults. So it is not going to help the situation if you reduce that risk anymore. It's going to look like a free range.
I just don't feel comfortable putting a growing, learning teenager in jail for a one-time mistake. Like, I just can't.
Who says it was a one-time mistake?
Why did we come up with a strike system? You know, repeat offenders completely.
Yeah, but then you're leaving room to repeat that risk. You're leaving room for people to go, okay, well, the benefits of that behaviour are way, way higher than my risks, because all I'm going to get is a slap on the wrist. Teenagers will process risk very differently than adults. Very, very differently. And that's all down to the biology of it. So actually, do we then punish teenagers potentially stronger just to even out that risk factor?
Maybe biology says yes. Ethics totally.
Ethics? No way in hell would anyone support that ethically. But from a biological perspective and a neurological perspective, like we've been talking about, is that the one that's most supported by the evidence?
I'm just not going to comment anymore because there's ethics.
I've put you in the corner there.
Yeah, that's going to be a really good question, but I don't want to. Let's just leave it there for today.
Let's leave it there.
And we hope you enjoyed, obviously, and every month we're going to be doing one. And obviously, because we're in lockdown, we're additionally going to be doing mini videos on psychological films and books to read.
I just watched Mindhunter. I love that show.
You should read the book. I read the book first. It's an autobiography.
You read the book? There's no season 3. I'm so disappointed.
The series is a little bit different to the book, but the book is amazing. It's my favourite book ever. We'll talk about that in the next one.
Yeah, we'll talk about it in the next one. Right.
But anyway, thank you for watching, and bye.